Welcome to the Royal United Services Institute for Defence and Security Studies podcast. We are independent and apolitical and are Australia's oldest think tank. We hold lectures and seminars, issue a monthly newsletter, a quarterly professional journal called United Service with the latest defence and security news, and support research with our extensive military and historical library. This is the Special Interest Group on Strategy, providing the current Geostrategic Issues report. We will begin with the war in the Ukraine. By the 22nd of February 2024, as the war entered its third year, a strategic stalemate pertained. Both sides were exhausted and were facing severe shortages of defence material and combat personnel, but Russia recovering faster. With the spring-summer fighting season now approaching, Russia is poised to go on the strategic offensive on land, while Ukraine has largely secured the western half of the Black Sea. On land, Ukraine remains on the defensive along the full length of the line of contact with Russian ground forces in the Donbass, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson sectors. Fierce fighting has continued along the entire line. The Russians seized Advichka in Donetsk Oblast on the 17th of February after 4 months of bitter fighting. It was Russia's first significant victory since seizing Bakhmut, also in Donetsk Oblast, on the 20th of May 2023. On the maritime front, Ukraine has made progress in its Black Sea campaign, employing missiles and drones to attack Russia's Black Sea fleet, reducing the fleet by 20% and forcing it to deploy to the east of Crimea. In late January, Ukraine sank a Russian missile corvette, the Yevonets, sheltering on Lake Donzulav in Crimea using 6 sea drones. On the 14th of February, Ukraine destroyed the landing cruise ship Caesar Kunikov. On the 5th of March, using Margura 5 maritime drones, Ukraine attacked a Russian patrol ship, Sergei Kotov, at the entrance to the Sea of Azov. The ship caught fire and later sank. These successes have enabled the Ukraine to maintain the maritime humanitarian corridor for its westernmost ports, thence along the Black Sea's western coast to Turkey. This has permitted the continued export of Ukrainian grain by sea, which has been vital for Ukraine's struggling economy and for food security in Africa and the Middle East. Meanwhile, Russia has continued harassing missile and drone strikes on Ukrainian cities, both in retaliation when embarrassed on the battlefield and to degrade Ukrainian morale. Ukrainian response has launched token missile and drone attacks on Russian cities near the Russian-Ukraine border. Russia has ramped up its manufacture of defence material and is receiving missiles, drones and other material from Iran and North Korea. Further, Russia has, with its much larger population, is much better placed to address its personnel problems than is Ukraine. Ukraine, in contrast, is facing war weariness among its supporters in Europe and the United States. Europe has largely depleted its war stocks and is considering placing its defence industry on a war footing. Strategic analyst Major General Mick Ryan forecasts that this year Russia will mount a wide-scale ground and air offensive across Ukraine. As the Russians continue to make small gains in taking Ukrainian territory, Putin will try to convince the world that only Russia is capable of winning the war. Volodymyr Zelensky, in contrast, will seek to preserve the sovereignty of Ukraine by minimising territorial losses. He also will want to preserve and rebuild his army. He has had to make a tough choice: hold territory and lose more troops, or surrender territory and preserve his military for future offences. Strategically, the latter makes more sense. This choice appears to have sharpened the recent decisions to withdraw from Avdiivka. 3 other presidential priorities will shape the trajectory of the war in 2024. First, an emphasis on strategic strike operations to keep Black Sea trade open and conduct economic warfare against Russian energy export infrastructure. Second, development of a reinvigorated diplomacy, strategic information and influence campaign to adapt to changes in Ukraine's circumstances and sources of support. Third, the reconstruction of Ukraine's armed forces, including mobilisation law, training in NATO countries and rethinking tactics. Zelensky has already directed that planning commence for a new counter-offensive, presumably in 2025. Against this background, President Zelensky last week accepted an offer from Recep Tayyip Erdogan, President of Turkey, to mediate an end to the conflict. A Russian response had not been received at the timing of this podcast, the 10th of March. Conflict in the Middle East. For background information, Hamas, the fundamentalist Sunni Islamic organisation that governs Gaza, launched a series of coordinated raids on Israeli towns and villages near the Gaza border on the 7th of October 2023. Employing the tactics and tools of terrorism, the raiders killed some 1,200 Israelis, mostly civilians, then withdrew, taking 253 hostages back into Gaza, some 130 of whom remain in captivity. This has led to conflict in Gaza, on the West Bank, on the Lebanon-Israeli border, in the Red Sea, and in Iraq and Syria. Gaza. Israel began a ground offensive on the 27th of October with a view to destroying Hamas and securing as many hostages as possible. Initially, the Israeli Defense Forces focused on northern Gaza, especially Gaza City. Once the north had been subdued, the IDF then moved to southern Gaza, especially Khan Yunis. The IDF then focused on central Gaza and now intends to assault Rafah, the last remaining Hamas stronghold, in the far south on the Egyptian border and the only crossing point into Egypt. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has ordered the IDF to draw up a dual plan for evacuation of some 1.7 million residents and internally displaced Palestinian residents from Rafah, followed by a ground assault. The US has strongly stated publicly that it does not support this proposal, but it continues to support Israel militarily and diplomatically. The UN points out that an evacuation on the scale that would be necessary would be nigh impossible. Netanyahu, nevertheless, is pressing ahead. Pressure from the international community, especially the US, in early March forced Israel to suspend its Rafah offensive plans while ceasefire negotiations were conducted in Cairo, mediated by Egypt, Qatar and the US, with a view to seek 6-week truce during which some Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners would be exchanged and humanitarian aid would be delivered to Gaza's starving civilian population. By the 10th of March, it appeared that the initiative had failed. The UN urged Israel not to extend its offensive into Rafah, and President Biden declared that Benjamin Netanyahu would cross the red line if he undertook the Rafah offensive. Israel's intentions are now unclear. The humanitarian situation in Gaza by the 10th of March was extreme. Gaza remained besieged by Israel. Some 30,800 Gazans had been killed since the war began. Health and social services had failed, and the population was on the brink of famine. Aid convoys were able to enter Gaza only with extreme difficulty. The worst affected areas seemed to be in the northern Gaza, to which the US and Jordan began delivering food aid by air parachute in early March. On the 10th of March, Europe initiated a Mediterranean maritime aid corridor from Cyprus to the coast of Gaza to ship in food, water, medicine and temporary shelter. The US announced that it would construct a temporary port at the Gaza shipment point, although this would take several weeks. Australia, with other Western nations, has halted temporarily its aid to UN Relief and Works Agency from Palestine refugees in the Near East in Gaza, while Israeli claims of UNRWA staff participating in the 7th of October Hamas assault on Israel are investigated. faced with evidence that those claims are false, Canada has restored UNRWA funding. For the present, Australia's funding pause remains in place. Looking at wider conflicts, Israelis are also clashing with Palestinians on the Western Bank, with Hezbollah on the Lebanese border, and with Yemen's Houthis, whose missiles can reach Israel. The danger of triggering a wider war in the Middle East involving Iran directly remains and threatens to draw in US and its allies. Indeed, US forces in Iraq and Syria have been coming under increased but sporadic missile attack from Shia militia thought to be acting as proxies for Iran. Iran itself, however, has been careful not to become directly involved against the US, and the US similarly has been careful to avoid direct conflict with Iran. Nevertheless, Iran did attack terrorist bases in Iraq and Pakistan in January, drawing a protest from Iraq and retaliation in kind from Pakistan. On the West Bank, over which the IDF provides security, clashes between Palestinian youths, Israeli settlers and the IDF have escalated over the past month. According to UN data, since the 7th of October, more than 400 Palestinians, 107 of them children, and 15 Israelis have been killed. This loss of life has attracted international concern. The widely reported death of 10-year-old Amir Najjar on the 4th of March, while sitting in his father's car at an Israeli checkpoint, has become a focus of that concern. Adding to that, on the same day, Israel announced plans for a further 3,500 settler homes in the West Bank and Jerusalem. In response, on the 1st of February, President Biden sanctioned 4 Israeli settlers responsible for escalating attacks on Palestinians, including forcing entire villages from their homes. This sanctioning probably will have more of a symbolic than a practical effect, given settlers enjoy virtual immunity from prosecution. In Lebanon, the militant Shia organisation in southern Lebanon, Hezbollah, is part of the Lebanese government and, given the powerless state of the Lebanese economy, does not want war with Israel at this time. Nevertheless, it has been assisting Hamas by exchanging sufficient artillery and rocket fire with the IDF since the 7th of October to keep substantial IDF forces pinned on Israel's Lebanese northern border and forcing the evacuation of Israeli settlers from the border area. Should war break out on this northern border, the IDF would find Hezbollah a far stronger and more capable opponent than Hamas. Nevertheless, as soon as the situation in Gaza has been resolved, Israel seems determined to drive Hezbollah forces well back from the border area, to create a Hamas-free buffer zone on the Lebanese side so as to allow Israeli settlers to return to their homes along the border in relative safety. Yemen and the Red Sea. Yemen's Houthis are Shia rebels supported by Iran, who now govern much of western Yemen, bordering on the Red Sea. Incensed by Israel's attack on Gaza and in support of Hamas, they are using Iranian-supplied missiles and drones to attack commercial shipping, including now cruise ships in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, in effect closing the Suez Canal, through which some 12% of global maritime trade travels. Recent Houthi attacks on commercial shipping have included on the tanker Pollux in the Red Sea on the 16th of February, the cargo ship Ruby Ma on the Bab el-Mandeb Strait on the 18th of February, the bulk carriers Sea Champion and Navis Fortuna east of Aden on the 19th of February, the cargo ship Islander on the Red Sea on the 22nd of February, and the bulk carrier Propel Fortune on the 8th of March. The last was part of a large-scale attack on US warships and commercial shipping. Of particular concern on the 6th of March, a Houthi missile attack on the bulk carrier True Confidence in the Gulf of Aden set the ship ablaze. It killed 3 and injured 6 of the 20-person crew who were forced to abandon the vessel. These were the first deaths to be recorded on ships in this Houthi war. The danger to crews and cargoes and increased insurance costs are forcing shippers to avoid the Suez Canal and to choose the longer route via the Cape of Good Hope. An international naval coalition led by the US is seeking to provide protection for commercial shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. The naval ships are intercepting many of the missiles and drones fired at the commercial vessels, but unless the Houthi bases are destroyed, the Houthi attacks are likely to continue. To this end, US and UK Air Force and naval strikes on Houthi rebel launching sites, arms caches, headquarters and the like in Yemen are continuing, but a ground assault on the bases does not appear to be in the prospect. Iraq and Syria. Since the main US withdrawal from Iraq in 2019, some 3,000 to 5,000 US forces have remained stationed in Iraq and Syria to help prevent a resurgence of ISIS. These forces have been coming under missile and drone attack from Iran-aligned terrorist groups that wish to expel the US from the region. On the 28th of January, 3 US Army Reserve engineers were killed and some 40 more US service members were injured, 8 seriously, in a drone attack on a US logistics base, Tower number 22 in Jordan. The US retaliated against Kataib, Hezbollah and other Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps aligned groups in Syria and Iraq, and further retaliation has been promised. Iraq has strongly objected to these US actions and is continuing negotiations with the US for the withdrawal of all US forces from Iraq. Now, the Sudan. The quite separate civil war in Sudan between rival factions in the Sudanese military government. The Sudanese armed forces under General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces under Hamid, which has been ongoing since the 15th of April 2023, continues unabated. Most fighting has been concentrated around the capital, Khartoum, and in the Darfur region. By the 21st of January, some 13,000 to 15,000 people have been killed, 33,000 others injured, and 5.8 million internally displaced. This is from data from the 31st of December. On the 9th of March, the UN Security Council called for an immediate ceasefire in Sudan to coincide with the Muslim holy month of Ramadan and to allow aid to get to the 25 million people in desperate need of food. The humanitarian response now being at breaking point. All parties were called on to seek a substantial resolution of the conflict through dialogue. Whether the two factions will take any notice is yet to be seen. China and the Philippines. On 5th of March, Chinese and Philippine Coast Guard vessels, Chinese maritime militia vessels and Philippine supply ships once again clashed in the South China Sea. 2 Coast Guard vessels collided. A Philippine supply ship was attacked with water cannon and 4 of its Filipino crew were injured as the ship attempted to resupply the small Filipino garrison on 2nd Thomas Shoal, some 105 nautical miles west of the Philippines in the Spratly Islands. This continued use of grey zone tactics, known as robust tactics just short of the US of kinetic force by China in an attempt to bully its neighbours into attempting its territorial claims, remains of concern internationally and especially among the nations bordering the South China Sea. Nevertheless, while the issue was discussed by the Asian-Australian Special Summit at its meeting in Melbourne on the 4th to the 6th of March, it did not raise the issue in its final communiqué. ASEAN operates by consensus and 2 ASEAN members depend on Chinese support. This report was prepared by the chair of RUSI Special Interest Group on Strategy, retired Brigadier David Leese, on the 10th of March 2024. Thank you.